Okay, so today is March 3rd, and as we like to kick things off, as we wait for folks to continue filing in, thank you all for those that have joined already. Make sure you hit that chat button, let us know where you're chatting in from. You are communicating with hundreds, if not, 1,000 of your colleagues all around the food industry. Just say hi to everyone and let us know where you're chatting in from and what you're seeing around you in the world of food. Today is March 3rd, and as has been a recent tradition, it turns out every single day of the year is multiple holidays, and sometimes they're food related. So some of the holidays that we have today is, you can actually look this up on Google or whatever your search engine of choice is. Today is actually National Cold Cuts Day. Did anyone know that? Huh. Did anyone working for a cold cut supplier know that today is National Cold Cut Day? Perhaps you are the folks that created this holiday in the first place. And if you look at what's happening with cold cut sandwiches, we have some data from Flavor. People really do love cold cuts. 69% of consumers in the US either love cold cuts, that's 29%, or like cold cuts. It is a highly loved and liked item overall. And the only thing I would note, and I think we saw something similar last week when it came to cabbage, or a couple of weeks ago, we're seeing the cabbage effect take place with cold cuts as well. That cold cuts are, most popular with millennials, Gen Xers, and boomers, but aren't quite as loved by Gen Z. Still more or less, really, really loved, but not nearly as high as in some of those other generations. I know from some of the sandwich research that we've done, and you see it in the data pretty clearly, younger consumers, or at least those folks from that generation, tend to like hot sandwiches more than cold sandwiches. And I think you see a little bit of that here. So National Cold Cut Day, but let's find a way to make those cold cuts even more appealing to that youngest generation because they need a little bit of a lift there. It's, you're gonna have to look this up. Today is also some sort of a soup holiday, isn't it? You wanna Google what it is? Anyone in chat, let us, can you remind us? It's like National something something soup day as well. Who's the first person that can figure out what soup holiday is today? Anything?
That's taken a few minutes to Google.
Okay, well, I'm sure something will come up in chat. So today is apparently a holiday all about, I think it's like Soup It Forward Day, something like that. And we could look in our flavor data and look at all different types of soups. Any guesses what the most popular soups in America are? Like you figure something like chicken noodle is going to be pretty high up there, but of all the different soups that are available, which ones do you think are most popular in America today? Today meaning, in general.
Chat is split between tomato soup, chicken noodle soup, broccoli cheddar, clam chowder. Clam chowder.
Okay, well, let's take a look. So we're just gonna look at maybe the top of the screen. Here's our flavor data organized as a giant data table. All you really wanna look at is this column over here that says the percentage of people that love or like that type of soup. So if you go beyond just generic soup or chili, it's chicken noodle, then beef stew, stews overall, beef chili, vegetable soup, chicken rice, potato. Ramen is actually pretty high up there. Ramen is actually a tick higher than tomato soup, even amazingly. Broccoli cheese, and the list goes on and on. Okay, so I think we did a pretty effective job of getting warmed up there, and now we can get into the real meat of today. The most important thing we can all do over the course of the next hour is chat and, share our thoughts and ideas on not just the content that's being presented, but pretty much anything from around the world of food that you want to chat about. You have the opportunity to get answers from hundreds of your colleagues that are, very, very smart and well-informed on any topic that you might care about as it relates to food. So please use that chat button. And when you do it, please choose all panelists and attendees or everyone to make sure that you're chatting to everyone and not just to myself and we. All right, so let's get started. I'm going to make this very quick. We've talked about COVID quite a lot over the course of the last couple of years. I'm hoping we're going to talk about it much, much less going forward. But I did want to ask, for those of you that saw, that watched the State of the Union a couple of days ago, I'm going to put up a poll question. And the poll question is this. So I'd say, answer this only if you actually watched it or watched, some substantial clip of it. How would you characterize the messaging on COVID from Tuesday's speech? Is it that we've nearly beaten COVID and now it's time to get back to normal, even if it's endemic going forward? Was the message that we still have ways to go, but we're making good progress? Or was the message that COVID is as dangerous as ever and we must remain as cautious and careful as ever? What was your view of how the messaging is around COVID? Because I think, the message here will probably have a big part in dictating what businesses and consumers do going forward, if it hits the mark on whatever the zeitgeist is. I wouldn't worry too much about you contaminating the results with your opinion, because I think people probably all have their opinions on this. Did you watch, or did you see bits and pieces of it?
I did not. I was planning on doing it today, actually, because I was busy the last 2 days. But yeah, I'm not entirely sure. I feel like it's either A or B.
Yeah.
Especially with the mask mandates going down across the country too.
Well, let's take a look. I'm going to pause. I'm going to stop voting now because we have a few hundred votes in. And let's take a look. I'm going to, share the results of how you all just voted.
Yep.
And then we asked this question a couple of weeks ago where we said, hey, what do you think the messaging will be in 2 weeks when the State of the Union is given? And here's what we thought back then. So the view of what the actual message was is actually pretty divergent from what we thought it was likely to be. Back then, only about a quarter of us thought that the message is, hey, COVID's done and over with. Now, 60% nearly of us think that that's the message that was given. So I think you're going to see, and frankly, this is not terribly surprising to me, but I think you're going to see sort of a rapid walking away from COVID as a normal topic of conversation in everyday life, and all the safety stuff that's been happening for a couple of years. It seems like that's going to start receding pretty quickly, but we'll see. Okay, so that's it. I'm not going to talk about COVID anymore today, and hopefully not much more going forward, and we can get into some other stuff. So thank you all for using ReportPro. This is our all-you-can-eat buffet of amazing content. When you're in ReportPro, make sure you check out the latest articles and reports we have on what's happening with plant-based, this time on all the plant-based retail stuff that's going on. There's also a great series on eating at home, which we've broken out generationally. So, we have a report on boomers, a report on Gen Xers, on millennials and Gen Z, and what their eating at home habits are, because this becomes really important, not just for retail, but for food service in particular, because that decision to get food is originating more at home today than ever. And if you want to sell something as a restaurant or something else to a consumer at home, you got to know where that decision is and how they ultimately eat. And this report tells you all about that. There is a great report too on the future of drive-thrus, where they are today and where we think they're going to be headed in the future. And there's just a lot of great stuff in ReportPro. So I think most of you and the companies you're at are using and subscribing to ReportPro. If you aren't yet, let us know. We'd be happy to show you a little bit more about it. And one of the really great pieces of content that just made it into ReportPro, we're going to actually spotlight a little bit today, and it's on something called PeertoPeer Foods. So I have with me Wee, who's part of our content team, and is the author of much of this research. And maybe can we just talk about what does peer-to-peer food actually mean? I don't know if this is a term that everyone's quite familiar with yet.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, this is something that, like, us on the content team, we've been bouncing around a couple of different names for this since we started identifying the trend. I think it exists on the macro trends Mac as like consumer to consumer food selling. But basically, to sum it up, it is this whole universe of people selling food, cooking their own food and selling it out of either their like home kitchens or out of a space that they found. It is for food vendors who are selling food that they make without a specific space, without a specific restaurant, without a lot of investment. So it's very, very on the ground, underground, from consumer to consumer. Yeah, Mike posted about this on LinkedIn. Yes, Catherine.
So, and so this picture is actually fairly representative. It's literally someone in their own kitchen doing something at home and finding a way to bring that food to market. And when you said underground, does that mean it's sort of like black market food, or is it available to find in normal ways, or do you have to go into the dark web to find the stuff?
No, definitely not anything like dark web, nothing illegal. Like I'm sure most of folks selling food out of their own homes actually have some form of food handling certification in some way, especially depending on the services that they're using to sell that food. So if you go to the next slide, we can actually talk about one of them. Yeah, so if you are familiar at all with this app is called Smeal. It came out in like 2017. And basically what this is, it's been compared a lot to it's called the Uber Eats of home kitchens. Basically, if you have something that you want to sell, like, hey, I make a really good cookie and I want to sell it to people, or I make a really good carnitas bowl, I can sign up as a cook on Smeal. I might have to take some form of food handling certification to be approved. And then if I'm a consumer and go, you know what, I want to try something new. I want to see what my neighbors are cooking up and what they're cooking. I want to buy food from them. Then I can go through Smeal and get that sort of like peer-to-peer food. If you could go to the next slide, we can actually see another competitor in this space. This is called Chef. Really strange how they all start with like an S instead of a C. Like there's like SH on top of like regular food words like food or chef or meal. But yeah, very similar concept happening here. I think a lot of folks like us at Datassential have been getting advertising for these two brands since we started like doing research about that. So it's just a really interesting space. When these apps came out, Jack, if you can go to the next slide, like media and investors sort of had this whole buzz about it. You know, like magazines and publications were writing articles about like, oh, do you trust your neighbors to cook you dinner? Like this startup wants you to get takeout from your neighbor's kitchen instead of restaurants. Home cooks can become entrepreneurs from this food delivery app. And a lot of these apps have also been able to raise a lot of capital for this idea that, you know, like by having neighbors sell each other food, you can create some sort of community. You can get to know each other better. You can try out new experiences that you can't find in any other places. So this was sort of a really big buzz a couple years ago. And if you go to the next slide, Jack, anything that's happening on these platforms across these past couple of years have also been happening a ton on social media. The next slide has a couple of screenshots that I took from my personal Facebook marketplace. Fat Tuesday was very recently. Mike here at Datassential made some delicious punchkis. But if you really wanted to buy them on Facebook Marketplace, you can get it for $18 and also $16 like nationwide shipping from a home cook who really like making punchkis. You can get a bunch of really random things from like actual meals to like jerky, sourdough starters, like anything under the sun, people are selling on Facebook Marketplace.
Seeing, so I mean, these all seem like things you could buy and you put in your pantry or you make later or something. Are we seeing much stuff where people are eating it like hot food, basically?
Yeah, definitely that too. I think, yeah.
Do you know what the legality is of this, or is this sort of operating in some sort of a gray zone? Is it definitely illegal, definitely legal, or not really one way or the other?
I would say definitely a gray zone. Like I think a lot of folks in the chat have also like are also experts on like food safety laws. And I think there's like something called like cottage industry laws, cottage kitchens, very loosely regulated, I would say.
I mean, I would sort of say for everyone that you see this, and if your first reaction is, oh, this is never going to be a thing, it's going to get shut down, or consumers don't want that, they're not going to trust it. I mean, the rental car industry didn't realize what Uber was going to do until it was too late. The lodging industry didn't realize the impact of Airbnb until it was too late. I don't see, other than some legislation or something, what would really be a roadblock to this actually having some legs potentially. So
right,
we should look at it.
And speaking about like, the legality and the experience of it all, you have these folks who I'm assuming to be just like sort of regular folks at home cooking their own food, but a huge section of this market also, like a lot of folks in the chat have pointed out, are from like former chefs and restaurateurs, like who are out of work, who had to close down their restaurants and are relying on social media or these apps as a way to like, build back capital or like experiment with a new concept. So I think a lot of where that is happening actually, Jack, is on Instagram. So the next slide are some of the examples I found that have been gaining a lot of traction. Dough Daddy is a pop-up pizza operator in Los Angeles. They sell things on a weekly basis. At the bottom left, you have Limonizal, which is two chefs who are selling pozole, which is a Mexican hominy soup in Chicago. Bottom right is Chef Victor from San Francisco selling arepas. You can see here he has like a schedule that he releases for when he's going to be biking around delivering his own food. He's selling it and also delivering it on a bike. And you also have other really interesting things like charcuterie boxes, cured fish, like everything under the sun. And all of these folks are former chefs.
So yeah, it actually feels like the same chefs that were looking to open a food truck in 2010 are the same types of people that would be looking to do this in 2022, right? It's sort of the same sort of impulse. We've democratized things a little bit further. Have you found that the food tends to be more interesting than traditional mainstream restaurant fare, or is it all still mostly basics, pepperoni pizzas and whatnot?
I would say that like, especially for like operations ran by chefs and like folks who used to own restaurants or like have experience in the space, definitely a lot more interesting and a lot more streamlined. Like you're not going to have someone selling like 20 different items, but you can have someone selling a very specific soup, but selling it in like 20 different varieties or like doing very interesting things to it. Yeah.
I mean, this really does feel to me like the concept behind why a food truck might have been appealing to consumers and to the person that was operating it. This feels like a logical evolution of that in some ways. It's sort of like a next gen food truck, but just in a different format.
Yeah, totally. Especially because like in the last 2 years, like folks lost their job, but also a lot of people stayed at home. And when you're staying at home, you're going to be on social media a lot more. So that's where you're going to get the eyes of the consumer. That's where you're going to get their attention and be able to sell something where you would otherwise rely on like foot traffic or like impulse purchase if you like walk across the street and see a food truck. So I think that's a really good analogy for it.
Maybe ask everyone in chat. You can just type, I guess, comfortable or not comfortable. Would you be comfortable ordering food this way, or is there something about it that would make you uncomfortable as a consumer, let's say? I mean, I guess like all sorts of weird things could go on, but I still feel pretty comfortable about it. There's something about social proof too, right? If you see other people doing it, how risky could it be? I don't know.
I'm seeing a lot of comfortables, and I'm also seeing a lot of not. Someone suggested doing a poll, but yeah, I think like our audience are also, I think, composed of a lot of foodies and people who are interested in food in general. So like, it makes sense that they're going to be more adventurous in something like this, right?
Okay, spotlight on operators.
Yeah. So I want to showcase an operator that I really enjoy. I live in Chicago, so this is very local to me. This is Funeral Potatoes. They are, Jack, if you press the next button, this is Eve and Alexis. They are two chefs. They formerly owned restaurants called Black Cat Kitchen and Diner at the Grotto. And then once the pandemic hit, they closed their restaurants down because it was like the early stage of the pandemic and things were very loose and uncertain. So during that process,
restaurants.
Sorry?
What was the name of the restaurants?
I think Alexis owned a place called Black Cat Kitchen, and then Eve on the left owned a venue called Diner at the Grotto. So two separate restaurants. Yeah. So, oh yeah, someone's saying that they're getting, Emily from Datassential is getting Funeral Potatoes later today. So hey, this is awesome. But basically over the pandemic, they closed their restaurants down, joined forces, and created some sort of like virtual home delivery meal program. They've been written about by all the local media, the Chicago Tribune, the Reader, Chicago Magazine, and they were even reviewed by Mike Sula, who is the Reader's like food critic. So it's really interesting stuff happening. If you could go to the next slide.
Why is it called Funeral Potatoes?
So Funeral Potatoes is a Midwestern dish. It's like sort of like a cheesy potato bake. Yeah.
Oh, that's actually a known common dish.
It's a very, very regional thing, super regional, but it's something that they have on the menu every week. They do
it's like where potatoes go to die. I mean, what's why is it called that?
I have no idea, but apparently it's huge in Buffalo, New York. I need to research that some more. But yeah, it's apparently very regional and very, very commonly served at funerals. Okay, there we go.
Oh, that makes sense.
Thank you, Haley, Jody, and Allison. But the way this works is every Sunday they release a weekly menu. That menu is unique to that week and they are constantly rotating. You have until 10 p.m. on Monday, so the next day, to place your order through a portal like a website like this. Then the food is ready on Thursday for pickup or delivery. And basically they send it to your home and you can just get whatever you want from that menu. Super small menu, like no more than 5 items.
So what's the address here then? Is that their house or they, I mean, how is this different than a restaurant, I guess?
Sorry, the address, I think they're using a commissary space now because this place has been active since 2020.
But it started off as something in their home that grew into something bigger. Got it.
Yeah. So the branding that you see here, their logo, the name Funeral Potatoes didn't even exist like until 40 weeks into their delivery program. So this is like something that gained enough traction for them to build structure around it. Here are some pictures of some of the food that they have. On the left here, you have a lobster thermidor funeral potato. So if you're thinking about like cheese, lobster, potato baked into one casserole, like really nice and creamy. They have like really upscale ingredients too. So they're like loaded with upscale cave-aged Gruyere, spiked with cognac, and like grated Parmesan all the way up top. On the right, you have applesauce.
Don't say it yet. I'm going to actually try an experiment. Do you think inside of 15 seconds, people can guess what that thing on the right is? Because I actually don't know.
Okay, yeah, sure.
So in chat, if you have an idea what that thing on the right is, guess, and let's see if anyone gets it in 15 seconds and we can tell us yes or no. 10,
okay.
9, 8. People got it already?
Well, a bunch of people are sort of in the right territory. Some people are saying meatloaf, which is not it at all.
I thought it was like a coffee cake type of thing.
Yeah, people are saying coffee cake, apple cake, and it is an applesauce cake. It is scented with vanilla, pan roasted with oolong tea from a Tanzania operator, and then it's topped with malted cacao nibs, streusel, and spiced sugar. So like, it's not like just your old regular applesauce cake or your regular baked potato. It's like really interesting food, and it's changing every week.
Yeah, awesome.
Yeah, so we actually then saw this trend and wanted to get some data on it. So we basically ran a survey with some consumers, and out of consumers who did try buying food from peer-to-peer vendors, not specifically funeral potatoes, just like any sort of peer-to-peer food vendor, some of the top motivations that like got them to buy are great reviews and comments from social media. I think the fact that these things exist on social media is a huge factor to how appealing they are because people see it and then they see other people enjoying it. So that feedback is instant.
I feel like reviews and ratings are absolutely essential. There's no way in hell I would buy food from one of these folks unless I saw reviews for it. Like, could you imagine being the first person to do it? Like, am I going to be poisoned? You know, there's all these thoughts that run through your head, but reviews help a lot. I think they're required basically.
Right. Other things about the platforms that really help these brands are photos and menu descriptions. Like if you're advertising on social media, you have to have good photos. And if people are seeing this on social media, then photos are essential. And then I also wanted to point out the second point there. Over a third of consumers who bought something from a peer-to-peer brand cited that they wanted to do it because they wanted to support a local small business. So, you know, the idea of community and like supporting small businesses, I think has become a lot more prevalent for consumers overall in the past 2 years, and certainly in this case as well. Yeah,
it's very true. We say that personal values is one of the most important things going forward around how people make food decisions, and that's very consistent with that. What do we see here?
And yeah, so we obviously, when we thought about this, you know, ideas about concerns about trustworthiness also came up. So we wanted to ask consumers, which of the following factors would you rank as most important that would make this sort of food vendor more trustworthy in your eye? And over here, it's really about sticking to basics. Certainly documented business permits are important, but more important than that is reviews from other customers like we've mentioned, and also a reputation for superior food quality. Like if you don't have the structure of a restaurant, you have to make good food. There's not a compromise for that.
If this type of thing, let's say, emerged before we had Uber and before we had Airbnb, do you think it would have been just sort of dead in the water? Like, do you think we needed those other things first as sort of an on-ramp to allow this to even exist for consumers?
I'd say probably yes, although I think if any social media platform existed, people have been selling things on it for as long as it's been alive, but certainly not up to the level of traction it's gotten now. Yeah.
So I think we think that this does have a future, and obviously a lot of it is going to be reliant on legislation or what happens there, but it seems like the impulse to do it by the chef/operator is certainly there, and the impulse to buy it is certainly there from consumers.
Yeah.
I don't know why this won't be a thing unless legislatively it's just killed somehow.
Right, exactly.
I don't know if you followed or anyone in chat knows if there's been any proposed legislation to actually make this easier or harder. I know there's something that was supposed to be going on in California a few years back. I don't think that quite went the way that the people that are proponents of this would have liked it to, but I wonder what's happening either in other states or around the country, if federally, if anyone has any thoughts. Please share them. Okay.
Yeah, definitely. Yep. Next, Jack. We asked consumers if they agreed or disagree with the following assessment. So in general, most consumers are still a lot more skeptical. Like 53% don't feel like they want to buy food and beverages on social media. But something I'd like to point out about this too is that like younger consumers, so Gen Z and millennials, are a lot more keen on agreeing. So like 64% of millennials, I believe, say that they like being able to purchase food on social media, while like 80% of boomers say they disagree. So it's definitely a very generational thing, much like any other new technology. Next, Jack. This is not surprising to me. Nearly over 2/3 of consumers say that like purchasing from these small food vendors, like your neighbors, the people you know, make you feel good about contributing to your local community, helping others around you, building a personal connection with someone that you may not have known before. So that community aspect is really important in this space. And then finally, we wanted to see if consumers thought that like any of these models could have some benefit to folks who are operating traditional food service venues. And like 3 in 4 say that like traditional food service venues can benefit from getting onto social media directly. And social commerce is something that we've written about for a couple months now on the content team. So that's something that we're also going to be exploring as a trend too. Yeah.
What's going on with street food?
Yeah, I think we talked about this a little bit earlier too, but I think street food is probably, and food trucks are really good analogies for this space. I think of peer-to-peer food vendors as more of like a transitory space, right? Like you do this to get somewhere else. I don't know if most operators would like to stay selling like this forever. I think they would like to build up to traditional food service venues. But this, I'm going to end with a quote from Eve and Thomas from Funeral Potatoes, where they're saying that like a lot of people perceive these alternative businesses as not legitimate business formats, but this has sustained them for almost 2 years now, more so than any other jobs they've ever had. So it's a good way for folks to make money and build capital, especially if they don't have the capital or the resources or the know-how to start an actual business. I think it's a way for them to bypass a lot of the traditional barriers of food service. So I think it's a very interesting space in general.
So what do you all think? Do you think we're all going to be talking about this in a much bigger way in, let's say, 3 years from now? Or do you think it's just going to be a weird little footnote somewhere in food and food service? I think it'll probably be a thing.
Yeah.
We thank you. If I can ask you to maybe just hang out while we talk about some other stuff today,
Absolutely.
that would be awesome. We're going to shift gears a little bit. I know we're running a little bit behind. We seem to always do that. So I'm going to talk a little bit faster. We often get asked, how do you tell the difference between a fad and a trend, right? I mean, Datassential looks at all sorts of, foods, flavors, things that look like maybe they're a trend, maybe they're a fad. How do you actually distinguish between the two of them? And I thought it would be great if we could just sort of share our view, sort of the algorithm that runs through our brains when we think about the notion of a fad versus a trend. And it really sort of breaks down into just 4 questions you need to ask yourself. The first is, does this thing address some sort of a new consumer truth or not, right? You know, the desire for immunity all of a sudden, it didn't spring up out of nowhere, right? It's been there a little bit, and it's been obviously seriously amplified as a result of what we just been through for the past couple of years. There is an underlying consumer truth to that. Or if you look at just, you know, the changing population, and I'm going to be a little US centric over here, of America, and you look at the percentage of folks that are white or non-white by generation, it's really quite different. We've shown this stat many times over the years, and it really is really notable that among boomers, it's a 72-28 split. By the time you get Gen Z, it's essentially 50-50 at this point. So you have a very, very different type of population that is diverse, not just individually, but it's fascinating. The pictures at the bottom were actually put together by, I think, like an illustrator or artist for National Geographic some years ago, where they said, hey, can you paint, you know, essentially create portraits of what we think the typical American might look like a couple decades into the future? And the thing that's really striking about these images is not just that there's diversity across the images, but there's diversity within each image itself. On each individual face, there's sort of like multiple things going on over there, and that really is reflective of where our population is and continues to head. And our food is certainly going to reflect that as well, which is why you see, you know, on the list of things that are growing fastest on menus or in consumer popularity year after year, quarter after quarter, it tends to always have a lot of representation from things that are from other parts of the world that are becoming more and more popular in the US. Oftentimes it lines up with increases in the population of, you know, people from those countries in the US. But sometimes stuff just comes here and everyone says, wow, this is delicious. And it just keeps going up, whether it's Korean barbecue growing 42%, matcha up 125% over the last 4 years, or elote up 94% over the last 4 years on restaurant menus. This all comes from our Snap and Many Trends service. The list sort of goes on and on and on. So is there an underlying consumer truth that's being addressed? The number 2 question you might want to ask is, was this maybe this thing that we're looking at that we're trying to decide if it's a trend or a fad, was it somehow enabled by a profound and durable new technology of some sort, right? I mean, so whether it's lab-grown meat or cultivated meat or cellular agriculture or cell-based meat or clean meat, or whatever the term that you want to refer to it as, this was certainly created through some new technology we didn't previously had. It could not have existed previously. So there is something about it that just wasn't true previously that could give it legs into the future. Or what's happened with the world of robotics, for instance, right? Some of this is because we all have cell phones now, and a lot of things that go into robots that have traditionally been very, very expensive for decades are things like sensors. And because sensors are created at such mass scale for devices like what we have in our phones, it's brought the cost down of making industrial robots and robots for home as well that will often use similar types of sensors, whether it's a camera sensor or something else. So you also think about what this might do for the world we live in right now, where you have things like labor shortages. So here's the Flippy robot from Misa Robotics. They have something that's being used at a number of White Castle locations already. Apparently you could buy this brand new Flippy 2 machine for about $3,000 a month, or starting at about $3,000 a month. And we think this type of thing is just going to continue to go. So technology enables it. Or as you've seen Mike talk about previously in this webinar, we have this very hard to define, not too hard to define. We have this exciting and or scary thing that is upon us that we are now calling the Metaverse, and restaurants are already sort of getting involved in that, right? McDonald's already doing something and staking their claim in the Metaverse. These are things that are enabled through new technology of some sort. And that is one of the hallmarks of something that could have lasting trend value. Doesn't have to be, but it is something else that puts it into that direction of it being more likely to be a trend than a fad. Another really big and important question to ask, and this might be one of the key ones, is did that thing come into being organically? Or did it maybe just get mainstreamed overnight via media or pop culture of some sort? I think most, if not all of you, are familiar with this thing that we call the menu adoption cycle, which basically says you could trace almost any food, flavor, ingredient, healthy term, way that style of consumer eating or what have you, through a fairly predictable four-phase life cycle where things tend to start at high-end restaurants in that inception stage and finally make it to adoption, then it moves to proliferation, and finally they get to ubiquity where that trend is just sort of everywhere, right? So adoption, that second stage is where you see gastropubs and really cool food trucks and maybe some of the peer-to-peer stuff that we just saw we talking about. That's when those folks are going to jump on the trend. Proliferation, chains tend to get more involved. In ubiquity, it's literally everywhere at that point. And the trend itself will morph over the course of its life. So when things follow that cycle, that is more of an organic evolution of a trend versus things that just all of a sudden jump into the mainstream overnight out of nowhere. That's inorganic. The organic stuff tends to be much more likely to be a durable trend, right? So if you follow, here's Italian cuisine as an example, just some of the stuff you might see in Italian cuisine. Don't worry about the little things like in each one of these little circles over here, but just know that if you pick something on the left in green over here, as it starts to grow, it will travel along this trend line, along this curve, at least directionally so. And when it does that, that tells you that this thing is not just going to fall away overnight. It is following a tried and true path that almost all real enduring trends will take. You look at something like sriracha, for instance, and its journey, right? From something that I think one of the earlier uses of it on American menus was at John George and some sort of like a lobster dish, which is very different than like a little squirt of sriracha on a burger or something that we see more commonly today. But it moved along a trend path, right? From those really early stage innovative restaurants to things that became much more common. It was organic evolution along the way. So that's something you want to ask. Did it evolve organically, or did it just sort of come into being because of some celebrity doing something, which tends to be much more inorganic? And then finally, is this thing that we're trying to categorize as either a fad or a trend, is it adaptable, versatile, and or generative in some way? So adaptable, can it sort of move in multiple directions? Versatile, can it be applied to multiple different types of food items? And generative, is it something that can actually maybe birth sub-trends that sort of extend from it? Can it be the mother, father of additional future trends that branch off from it? So we look at something like plant-based, for instance, right? It's been growing like crazy. It's grown 2,700%, 2,800% over the last 4 years on things like restaurant menus. It's on almost 5% of menus now, which is really impressive, even as a term, just the words plant-based. And you can see why, right? Because it's super versatile, super adaptable, and it's generative too, right? There's just so many ways that plant-based can manifest. It's not a one-trick pony, whether it's jackfruit in a sandwich as sort of a pulled pork replacer. So you have all the meat analog versions of plant-based. You have the versions of plant-based where the plant, I think this is like a kale in some sort of a Reuben type of application, where the vegetable becomes the star and it's not known just to be a replacer of something that otherwise would have been meat. That's another version of plant-based. Or it's things like nut milks, where it's certainly plant-based, but it has nothing to do with the notion of meat or anything, right? There's different ways that plant-based can exist, and because there's so many ways it can happen, it is more likely to be a long-term trend than if it were some sort of a one-trick pony. Now, I will say, as a complete aside, I don't know if this is true because I've seen this study quoted many times. Did you all know that plants scream in pain when you cut them? They've actually done research on this. Scientists discovered plants feel pain and shriek. They had let out an ultrasonic shriek when they are cut or aren't watered. Like, can you imagine if we found out one day that plants were all screaming in pain, and each time we ate something that was like a vegetable, we're actually causing enormous pain to the plants, and like this entire civilization of plants that we weren't even aware of, you know, they're committing like carrot genocide or something. I don't know. So I'm going to move on from that thought, but if any of you seen that study, it's definitely out there, and who knows, this shows what an interesting world we live in. So one of the things that we try to do is understand the notion of versatility, right? This is that fourth question. Is it adaptable, versatile, and or generative? And in our Snap platform, we actually have a metric that we always recommend people check out when you look at something. So we're looking at turmeric, for instance. There's this little box over here that's our versatility box, and it has two numbers. It has a menu versatility score, and it has a food versatility score. The menu versatility score says, hey, is this item, turmeric in this case, is it something that you might find in many different types of restaurants, right? Are you likely to find it in American restaurants and Chinese restaurants and smoothie places and, you know, all the different types of restaurants that might be there? And the higher the score, the more likely it is to exist in multiple types of places, as opposed to being, you know, a sauce that you would only find in, you know, an Ethiopian restaurant, let's say. Then you have the food versatility score. What that says is this something that's used in multiple different types of food items, right? Is it something that you only find in an alcoholic beverage, or do you find it in alcoholic beverages, as well as sandwiches, as well as salads, and everything else that you could potentially eat? And as these scores get higher, you have a higher tendency for this thing that we're looking at, in this case, turmeric, to be a long-term trend, because there's just so many more ways for that trend to express itself, either in different types of foods or different types of places that serve food. So those are the four questions you really want to ask yourself if you're trying to discern if something is a fad or a trend. The rule of thumb is you don't have to answer yes to all of these, but as the answer becomes yes to more and more of these four questions, it becomes more likely to be something like an enduring long-term trend, right? Does it address some sort of a new consumer truth? Is it enabled by profound and durable new technology? Did it come into being organically? And finally, as we just talked about, is it adaptable, versatile, or generative? So keep coming back to us and asking us what we think about different foods, flavors, ingredients, if it's a fad or if it's a trend. Or you could use these four simple principles yourself, which is sort of what we do over here. Okay, I wanted to talk about some data we have in our flavor system, which sort of speaks to this. And we can do a quick time check. What time do we have right now?
Like 15 minutes, Jack.
Okay, so as you know, flavor is our service that looks at anything you could eat or drink, thousands of different foods, flavors, ingredients, etc. And we measure if consumers know what that is, if they've had it before, do they love it, do they hate it, do they fall somewhere in between. I think we looked at this for cold cuts and soups at the outset of today's talk. And we wanted to sort of understand something about consumers' approach to different flavors. And I really wanted to get at what does this mean when you look at different types of consumers, right? The different types of consumers from different generations or, you know, different other backgrounds. Does that help predict people's attitudes towards foods, flavors, ingredients, etc.? And if you remember that menu adoption cycle that we talked about, everything in our flavor service is typed by its corresponding stage of the menu adoption cycle. So you could say, for instance, I only want to see inception level foods, flavors, ingredients versus I want to see the ubiquitous food, flavors, ingredients, right? Do I only want to see the really crazy, new, funky stuff from other countries, or do I want to see, you know, hamburgers, pizzas, etc.? What we wanted to do here is focus on inception, that first early stage, right? That stage where things are really new, interesting, tends to be higher end applications or really authentic adaptations from other cultures. and see what level of interest people have in those inception stage foods, flavors, ingredients. So we've aggregated together all the inception stuff, and then we've looked at the affinity for those items as a whole, right, by taking an average of hundreds of different items. And we then broke that out by different types of consumers. And I think the patterns you see here are really, really interesting, right? So this is the percentage of consumers that love and like these hundreds of different inception items, and we just sort of averaged all those items together and then cut it by these different consumer groups. So the things that I would sort of point out over here is, one, you certainly see an income effect, right? People from higher income backgrounds tend to have a greater affinity for these early stage things. And it totally makes sense because they're probably much more likely to have been exposed to these early stage things because they often debut in things like in places like fine dining, for instance. You also see an interesting thing where foodies, as you might expect, are more interested in early stage stuff. But there's a couple of other things too. One is that this little line here, this yellow one, which looks at generations, for years, up until maybe 4 or 5 years ago, we'd sort of assumed that each subsequent generation was going to be more into food and more interested in like new foods and flavors and whatnot, and really want to like study food and learn about it, and essentially being more and more like foodies. But it became pretty obvious when we looked at the data starting about 4 or 5 years ago that foodie generation seems to have peaked with millennials, right? You know, you don't see a higher spike here for Gen Z than you do for millennials. Once we get past the millennial generation, the absolute interest in food as a thing and want to study all things about food and learn about it actually tends to decline among Gen Z. And I thought we could maybe talk about how that actually manifests a little bit. So looking at the data, we're going to look at, just as an example, something like avocado oil. This is the percentage of consumers that love or like avocado oil, right? Avocado oil is an earlier stage ingredient. And you can see the numbers go 25 for Gen Z, 38 for millennial. So there's a plus 13 advantage that millennials have over Gen Z. 38% of millennials love or like avocado oil versus just 25% of Gen Z. So it's a plus 13 for millennials. And this pattern tends to repeat for a lot of other food trends, right? Whether it's something like biryani, which has a plus 8 among millennials. Almond butter has a plus 16 among millennials. And you see this a lot of times, especially from foods and flavors from around the world as well. So the question then is, well, if you have all these items that have a big plus among millennials and are not as interesting to Gen Z, what are some of the things that Gen Z loves in particular, right? Where do you see the effect going the opposite way where Gen Z likes it more than any other generation? I don't know. So if you want to maybe venture a guess in chat what those things might be, here's sort of what we found. The first thing I want to note, and this is such an important insight, I think, is if you ask people why you like to try new things or what would motivate you to try something new as it relates to food, and you say you got to choose. Is it because you think it's going to taste great, or are you interested in trying something new just because it's new? You get a really interesting set of lines over here. Among boomers, it's like, hey, if I'm going to try something new, I want to be pretty sure it's going to taste good. But by the time you get to Gen Z, it has crossed over, and it's crossed over significantly, where you have a much greater likelihood, that green line over there, where they're going to say, I'm going to try something new just because it's new. I don't have to have confidence that it's going to taste the way that I want it to. I'm willing to try stuff that's new just for news sake. So that is the underlying foundational insight here. And I think you start seeing this play out in things that feel new to consumers or feel like they're fun or wacky in some way. I'm certainly not saying that, boba is necessarily wacky, but I think it has a little bit of that to its ethos, which is why you see a plus 14 among Gen Z for things like boba versus for millennials. Concha, right? These sweetbreads, a plus 8 right? There's something very just sort of like new and interesting looking about them, and some sense of fun. Sandia Loca, that crazy watermelon, that over the top watermelon, which is sort of a social media thing a few years ago. Higher interest among Gen Zers than among other generations, and a 4% gain over millennials as well. I think that's the effect you're seeing here, right? The notion of new for new's sake, or corn ribs, right? Have you all seen this TikTok sensation from a few months ago? A +8 among Gen Zers versus even more so than millennials. And I think the thing that we can sort of conclude is that notion of TikTok foods. If we go back to that note, what's a fad versus a trend? The individual TikTok foods themselves, corn ribs, those are probably sort of fads, right? They were manifested by social media overnight. There's no real particular reason for them coming into being. It's not like some new technology was created. It's not like there's some new underlying consumer need where your ribs have to look like corn all of a sudden. They didn't follow that organic path through the menu adoption cycle. They tend not to be super adaptable because these are just corn in the shape of a rib. Those individual foods tend to be fads, but the notion of TikTok foods as a family of things overall, that is certainly a trend. And we're gonna see much more of this going forward. And you almost wanna start thinking about, well, should we start playing in some of these micro trends, or you might even call them fads, right? Some of the individual specific stuff, because as a family of things, they will certainly continue to keep growing. Okay, I think we might have actually finished on time today. I don't know. But I wanted to let you all know that in 2 weeks, we're going to have an amazing trends episode, bringing in Renee and Mike, who are always two of our favorites, talking about all the amazing stuff we're seeing in food trends, and maybe even a few fads from around the world of food and food service, both in this country and abroad. So please join us in 2 weeks, March 17th, noon Central Time. And I want to thank you all. And if you want to maybe just hold on for one quick second while we get put away, that would be wonderful. Thank you, everybody. We'll see you in a couple of weeks.